All right, good morning. Welcome back here to Trader Minute. Great to have you aboard. Market has about an hour here before it opens this morning, and we're looking at a market that went limit up last night. Now, what does that mean? Well, limit down means that the S&P futures fell by 5%, and so what did they do? They halted them, but not a, hey, you can't trade these anymore type of halt. They basically said Sunday night you can't trade below 2174. Anything above, fine, is to trade, but anything below 2174 is halted. Well, last night market went limit up as it hit up here to 2333. That was a 5% gain in S&P futures. And so it was, hey, limit up. And what did that mean? Well, it meant that futures can't trade higher than that, but they can trade lower. And you can see they've backed off of that level by about 20 points here and have been ticking along this morning on some just absolute massive volumes. We started to see some pretty heavy volumes yesterday. We've seen some of that volume continue here in the after hours and pre market today. And I suspect today could be a pretty high volume day overall. But if we back things out and put the overall move in this limit up, limit down in perspective, here we are with S&P futures, pretty much at the lows of last week, okay, and not breaking the rally that we saw in the pre-market yesterday with the Fed and the Fed stimulus that came in. So it's limit up, and it's a big rally set for a big gap up set here for this morning. But from an overall location perspective, we're not all that changed. Volatility is still pretty heavy, but we should see the VIX drop by about 10% this morning if some of the pre-market indications are correct. That's a massive move. We should also see a pretty big bounce in the banks here this morning. And we've talked overall that if we're going to see a bottom, we do need to see a bottom in the banks. Yesterday we saw the banks get hammered again as the yield curve continues to flatten. This morning does look pretty broad based in terms of the bounce. We're seeing it in energy, financials, materials, tech, healthcare. Everywhere this morning is bouncing in what looks to be a rather equal bounce across the board. So no massive differentiation to look at here just yet. But going to be a very interesting morning, a very interesting day in terms of how things ultimately evolve and move here. We're going to continue to see some pretty heavy relief bounces in stocks like Royal Caribbean. Royal Caribbean, this is one that we talked about, what was it, early last week. I mentioned I had bought some, just as a bottom picking, not options, but just the stock, and I bought it here, around 30 and just made the comment, look, I can't guarantee this is a bottom. I have no idea. It's just we could keep going lower, but if we bounce, I do expect we at least come back above this level. This morning we're going to see Royal Caribbean trade above that level. We're going to see a lot of stocks start to recapture their 7-day moving averages on this gap. And so it's going to be a different style bounce than some of the bounces we have seen during this drop here so far. I'll be very interested to see if we see the metrics move, what happens to some of the volatility, what happens to some of the ATR. From an option perspective, we need some of the implied volatility to drop off to make some of these tradable. We talked last week that trading initial bounces tend not to be super profitable for option traders just simply because the implied volatility that comes out. but that secondary move tends to be very profitable, and that's what I want to be on. If I'm bottom picking, that's what I want to be on a market vibe turn. Am I going to be on those for something like a Bank of America with the challenge algorithm? Probably not, just simply because we're not going to see some fresh crossovers. But you see the volume we saw in Bank of America yesterday: 175 million, 181 million shares traded, just a monster, massive number. And with the way that we have seen things ebb and flow here over the last several days, could we see some short-term bottoming here? We could. Now, could this get sold very quickly, just like yesterday? Yeah, that's always going to be a possibility. But, this is one that, for me, I'm looking for a little bit of a turn, looking for signs of a turn. And, so far haven't had many. And I've showed the different things I'm looking for in terms of the volatility, in terms of the average true range. In terms of the number of stocks above a 7 and a 20-day moving average. So we'll see how those play out here this morning. So limit up and boom. Now we do have a couple comments this morning. One of them by Goldman Sachs, basically saying it's time to buy gold. And gold is going to jump here this morning. Gold is up big here overnight. And it is going to erase the entirety of these losses that it has taken on the coronavirus. And it's one where Goldman is basically saying it's the currency of last resort, which at least they're making an currency argument for buying gold rather than a fear argument. And we've talked about gold a lot. I'm very bullish long term. But gold has not been a hiding place in terms of, hey, if the market goes down, gold's safe, it'll go up. It's one that, yes, it's taken losses along with the rest of the market, but nowhere to the same degree, percentage, or anything like that. Today's gap is going to be a little tough to want to chase when it comes to gold. The GLD is going to gap up about 9 points here. It's going to be a little tough chase. But, continuing on with the overall bullish themes here with it, and I don't think they go away. I think the bullish themes for gold only continue, for years to come, and there will be volatility points and pullbacks and rallies, but this is something where you look at the amount of money that's getting poured into markets overall and the pace at which they're going to pull the money back out when this crisis is over. It bodes very, very well for gold. This whole crisis only supports the gold thesis when it comes to what central banks and governments around the world are doing. Now, the headline this morning on Market Watch is why a Wall Street strategist says it's dangerous for investors to be negative on stocks, which is interesting. But one of the things that we will continue to see is more money kind of rushing into the market, and let's face it, there's no real alternatives for where that money can go. So once we get some sign that the coronavirus element is over, once we get the fact that these margin calls are over, we're going to go from a crash scenario, which is absolutely what we've been in. Has it been a one-day crash? No. But this has been a crash in every sense of the word when it comes to the market. Are we going to get that relief bounce? Yeah. When's it going to happen? Anyone's guess. I do think there could be some signs to point into it here today. But, that we could see follow through to today's rebound or this morning's rebound. But, the situation out there is still fluid. The coronavirus stuff is still on the rise. We are seeing reports out of the Wuhan province about things getting back to normal and things in China getting back to normal. But we saw some of that last week. I think a lot of investors are looking at Italy to say, hey, are we starting to get back to normal? Because that can give a time frame for when the rest of the world will start to get back to normal. And I think investors are really kind of looking at that, eyeballing that. But they're going to have a minefield of some very negative data, very negative, negative reports coming out. And speaking of negative reports, Chevron came out this morning. They suspended their stock buyback, but they did something interesting. They kept their dividend. And why is that interesting? Well, if we pull up their dividend here, their dividend has risen to almost 10%. To put that in a historic content or a historic context here, my apologies, dividend yield, this is where it was 8.47 a day and a half ago. It's never been this high, never even close to this high for Chevron. It's a massive monster dividend percentage after this pullback. And Chevron said, yeah, they're going to stop buying back shares, but they're not going to cut their dividend, which is very interesting, which is going to give investors a little confidence to jump into Chevron. Can you find a little hiding spot here in Chevron? And we talked about oil last week, where, it's one where, a lot of negatives in the space, and rightfully so with everything that's gone on, but companies with refining exposure and very cheap oil drilling, and Chevron has both of those, are going to be some of the better ones to hold coming back. I mentioned ConocoPhillips and Valero being two of my favorites, but after seeing what Chevron has had to say here this morning, I have to put Chevron on the list. I am very surprised they did not cut that dividend. And, it doesn't mean they're not going to cut it going forward, but, keeping a dividend at this level, they had every possibility to cut, every reason to cut, every justification to cut, and they didn't. And that, I think, is going to resonate with investors that are trying to, dip by the energy space. And put Chevron high on the list for many investors who want into the space there. Thanks for hopping on. I'll be around here this morning. If something crazy happens, I'll jump back on. But I most likely will jump back on later this afternoon at the normal time to take a look at any signals, metric changes, option values here with you. Hopefully, this is going to be some sort of sustained bounce and we get some sort of trade setup. But that probably won't happen initially this morning. And so I'll be just kind of observing, watching what's going on with options and some of the price action out there, and then share my thoughts with you here this afternoon. And hopefully with a little luck, we do see some things that allow us to jump back on that horse and look to jump back into some challenge trades here, here this week. Again, thanks for hopping on. Wish you and your family the best and stay safe. And we will talk to you this afternoon. Take care.